Welcome to So and So, brought to you by BERNINA, made to create. I'm Meg Goodman, and I welcome you to the 100th episode of So and So. We're celebrating an incredible milestone for this podcast, which began back in February of 2021 with our very first guest, the extraordinary artist Bisa Butler. Thanks to the support of BERNINA, So and So has become a vibrant community where sewists and quilters who are creators, innovators, and artisans come together to share their stories. Over the years, we've been honored to host iconic figures like Fassett and Mably, who revealed how color can be a life-changing force, and Tula Pink, who welcomed us into her imaginative, boundary-pushing world. We heard from Alex Anderson, who reminded us of the importance of claiming space for our creativity, and Amanda Murphy, who inspired us to stretch the boundaries of traditional quilting. This journey has introduced us to countless other inspiring voices. Astronaut Karen Nyberg, who shared her love for quilting in space, Michael Thorpe, whose bold textile art challenges conventions, and the incomparable Justine Quilters, represented by Mary Margaret Pettway, whose work connects us to a rich heritage of storytelling through fabric. We've also learned from quilting luminary Ricky Timms, who shared his unique blend of music and quilting, costume designer Justine Seymore, and Julian Collins, who creates fashion with purpose. Mimi G brought her vibrant energy and DIY spirit, while Deanna Springer reminded us of the enduring legacy of Nancy Zieman and the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. We brought you behind the scenes at Quilt Week in Paducah, BERNINA University, C2E2, QuiltCon, the Sewing and Stitching Expo, Houston Festival, the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show, and the National Quilt Museum. And our guest list goes on. Gail Yellen with her expert sewing techniques, sustainable designer Tristan Detweiler, creative advocate and comic Christina Wong, and reality star Craig Conover from Southern Charm, who we accompanied to North Charleston High School as he donated BERNINA sewing machines to their makerspace. We've heard from visionaries like Jean Wright from Sew Sisters and fabric artist Cookie Washington, each of whom has left an unforgettable mark on our community. As we reflect on these first 100 episodes, we're profoundly grateful to each guest who has shared their time, talent, and insights, and to each of you who have been with us on this journey. So now let's celebrate by taking you back to February 18th, 2021, to where it all began, with a replay of our very first episode featuring the incredible Bisa Butler. Here is So and So episode number 1. Bisa, welcome to So and So.
Thank you so much for having me, Meg. I've been looking forward to this all week.
You know, your art is amazing. Just to start this off, our listeners need to go to YouTube and see some of the videos there after they listen to this, because it's just beautiful. But I want to jump right in because I'm super curious here. You talk about the artistic epiphany you had while you were at Montclair State University. And tell us about that. I want to know more.
Sure. Well, while I was at Montclair State, I was studying to be an art teacher, and thank goodness they had certain requirements. I already had a BFA, and I thought that, I really thought at that time, to be honest, that my career as an artist was never going to happen, and that art wasn't really for me in the way that I thought. I had studied painting at Howard University. I had finished my degree, but I never had that inspiration and that drive that makes you want to create on your own in your free time. And also that my paintings just didn't look, they weren't eye-catching, at least not to me. I didn't feel anything when I saw my paintings, and I'm pretty sure other people didn't feel anything either.
Sure,
So
sure.
I decided, but I still loved art and I thought I could teach. And I had a small child at that time. My daughter was I think she was about 4. And I was getting my master's in art education at Montclair State. And they had this requirement that everybody had to take, all art students, no matter what the discipline, had to take their requirements were you had to have fibers and jewelry making, along with all of the undergrad studio courses, like if it was painting or drawing or art history. And I didn't have that at Howard. We had totally different undergrad requirements. And that was such a blessing for me because, well, jewelry making was super fun. And fibers was a whole new world. They had a really strong, feminist centered, women run department. I think there were three powerful professors who ran that department. And they had a really strong push towards weaving and female centered, I would say traditionally female centered arts. And it was in that environment that I had to make a little quilt for class. And I realized that I didn't have to let go of art altogether, that I could still do what I love, which was I was sewing clothing for me and my little daughter. I could express my creativity and I could do things that I felt deeply and that other people could feel as well. I finally hit that sweet spot in grad school.
I have to ask, do you still have that little quilt?
I do.
You
I
do.
do. I don't have the super duper first one that I made in class, which was like a oven mitt, but my final project for that same class, I made a portrait of my grandmother and my grandfather, and I do have that piece.
That's beautiful. Now, speaking of your grandmother, you cite your mother and your grandmother's teaching you how to sew, and you talk about your grandmother's influence on your art because of her Creole background. You also said you were surrounded by art as a child, and I'd love to know about those early influences on what you do now.
My grandmother was the typical 1970s grandmother. I mean, she didn't work. She had 10 children, and my grandfather was a U.S. emissary to Morocco. So she raised my mother and all of the other 9 siblings in Morocco, although she was from New Orleans. So she's this Black American woman who thank goodness she spoke French, transplanted in Morocco in the 50s and 60s, and they had all of these embassy parties to go to. But my grandfather wasn't a rich man. This is just a regular middle class family. But where were they going to get all the clothes to wear to all these fantastic diplomat events and meet this person and that? So they would look in Vogue magazines, and they would look in the I think it was Paris Match magazine and Marie Claire, and they would pick out outfits, and they all knew how to sew. By necessity, I say that sometimes because the necessity was that they wanted to look good. So that,
Mhm.
that was the necessity. And they would make their own patterns and design sort of replica Christian Dior gowns or replica Yves Saint Laurent two-piece suit.
Mhm.
And they were using all these fine fabrics and laces and silks and silk dupiones, all these cool textures. And every time, because my grandmother was a child of the Depression, when they finished an outfit, she would put those little scraps in plastic. She would kind of like wrap them in saran and just save them. Even though these were small pieces, you couldn't really make anything else from them.
Mhm.
And you also could not, she wasn't a quilter, so I don't know what she was saving the scraps for, but thank God the way it worked out that years later when I started making quilts in grad school, I didn't have a lot of money for fabric. So the first people I turned to were my mother and my grandmother. Like, do you have fabric? They both had sewing rooms, designated sewing rooms in the house. And my mother, I remember opening up this big drum, and it was just filled with all of those scraps of silk and um, wool gabardine, like really fine fabrics. So I ended up originally using those little bits of their lives in my quilts because I needed fabric and I thought that fabric was beautiful. I didn't know the rules at that time that you were supposed to use quilters cotton. I was working with what I had. And that ended up really, in the long run, helping me because it helped me form a philosophy early on that if I was doing a portrait of my grandfather, why not use fabrics that he wore? And that meant that I was using those wools and those tweeds and his suiting fabrics. When I did the portrait of my grandmother, I thought about her and her personality and her growing up, like you mentioned, in New Orleans. They were mostly, the Black population is like, I think, 90% Catholic. At least it was for years. So a lot of the photos that they had, their family photos, would have been like on Easter or at church events, standing on the church steps. And so I used fabrics that I had seen her wear in photos and fabrics that my mother had given me that were hers, which were laces and really delicate fabrics. So right away it became like these fabrics can define the personality of the person that I'm portraying, not just what they look like.
Maybe it's a good thing you didn't know the rules, right? And you made your own.
Right.
And it sounds like your family's heart is in a lot of your art just because of what you used. And based on that, I've read that you have made this comment about your art. You call it excavating your soul, which I thought was an incredibly provocative comment. Tell us more about that. What is that?
The excavating of the soul, I think about it in two ways. When I get inspired to make a piece, my jump off point is always a vintage photo. I love pouring through the archives, National Archives, the Library of Congress archives are public. And recently I was able to look through some of the Smithsonian archives as well. And what is captivating are these photos of these people staring out at me. And sometimes I almost feel like they are demanding my attention. Like, for instance, I came across a vintage photo of Frederick Douglass when he was a young man. And so I'm just scrolling through the archives, relaxed. And then all of a sudden, this magnetic gaze grabbed me. And I'm looking, and it just really struck me that I never really looked at Frederick Douglass I should say, I never slowly looked at Frederick Douglass and saw him not just like as we think of him, like this orator and this leader and this abolitionist, but just as a man. And not only that, in the photo that I saw, he wasn't even 30 years old. So him as a young man is an entirely different energy than the Frederick Douglass that I was presented with in school and how I imagined him. And I decided to make a quilt of this piece. And as I worked on it, I'm reading about Frederick Douglass and I'm thinking about the things that he went through. And then I'm seeing the evidence of such. If you zoom in on this photo, you can see this, like, it looks like a dark mark in his eye. And then when you read his autobiography, it says that he almost lost that left eye when his, I think it was overseer, beat him so bad that he almost went blind. But he carried those scars for the rest of his life. And it it does something to you to observe that up close and see the evidence of the pain that he suffered, and then relating him to him eye to eye and person to person. So when I say like excavating the soul, it was like my own spirit as well involved in this unspoken conversation with somebody who was long past.
It's interesting that you talk about his eyes. One thing I noticed in looking at the video of your exhibit in Chicago was the look in the eyes of the subjects, that they, through the fabric and the way you use it, they are looking at you, and that's notable.
Yeah, I'm super glad that it can connect the same way I feel it and see it. I feel like that's such a blessing all the time that other people can connect with that piece as well. So when other people see my work now, let's say if you were looking at the Frederick Douglass piece or you were in the Art Institute, like you mentioned, um, it's like they are also now talking to you over time, over space.
The good thing about what we're talking about is if people listen to our conversation and then experience your art, I think they'll be able to experience it more fully now with your description of this. Um, One of the things you've talked about is the influence of the Afro-Cobra culture, which actually began on the south side of Chicago in the 1960s. You said that this has had a profound effect on what you do. Can you tell us a little bit about the culture and the influence it's had on your work?
Sure. My professors at Howard in the painting department, and actually in other departments as well, but primarily painting, were all from the Afro-Cobra group. And the dean of the school, Jeff Donaldson, was one of the founders of Afro-Cobra. And then Frank Smith, he was a member of Afro-Cobra. Wadsworth Jarrow was a member of Afro-Cobra. And so these men and women, I should say, had that philosophy from when they were very young, in their 20s. And the philosophy was, well, Afro-Cobra stands for the African Commune of Bad and Relevant Artists.
I love that.
Me
That's
too.
that's beautiful.
I think it's an absolutely poetic description, and it gives you the the vision of how these kids, and at the time they were kids, how they looked when they formed Afro-Cobra. Like you can see the afros and the platforms like in your mind. And
Mhm.
they basically were the visual element to the Black Power movement. And they decided that all of the artwork that they would make would they would make sure that their art taught Black people about their own history. They made sure that their art celebrated Black features, Black lips, hair, skin. And these things were new then. To me, I mean, I've grown up with the idea that Black is beautiful or we should be proud of ourselves. But prior to that, in the more like assimilationist mindset, it would be more like minimize your blackness, straighten your hair, maybe try to tuck your lips in when you speak so that they don't look full. Nowadays, everybody outlines their lips on the outside, like their lipstick. The idea is to get your lips to look fuller. But when you look at vintage photos, and even of white women, you see like they're drawing the lipstick really right in the center so that your mouth can look as small as it can possibly look. And that was very, very difficult for Black people to not see themselves in artwork for hundreds of years. And then here comes the 60s, and there's this explosion of like Black pride and culture. And our professors would press us as well. They would say, like, your artwork needs to mean more than we weren't allowed to just make decorative art. And I would say that we weren't allowed, but in a way, their influence was like, your art should be for the people and it should be healing when your people see your artwork. A lot of Black people, even now, might feel reticence or reluctance in going in an art gallery because they're not represented in the art gallery. Or maybe, the gallerist or so, maybe they're standing by the door. They feel as if they're unwelcome in that space. If you walk in most of the museums across the country, you're not going to find a lot of Black art in there. You're not going to find a lot of Black curators in there. It's just not a space that is necessarily where you feel welcome. And so they felt in order to counteract that, your artwork should always make your people feel welcome. When they look at it, they should see themselves and it should be accessible. So it shouldn't just be in an art gallery. They really were some of the forerunners or foremothers and fathers for the mural movements and creating these. They had this wall of pride that was made in Chicago that it had figures of Black history on it. And people could walk by that and see a giant portrait of Nina Simone or a portrait of Frederick Douglass or Sojourner Truth. And that was important for them to make art accessible, make art that Black people could see themselves in. And also, they wanted to educate Black people if they didn't recognize that they were beautiful or that they were of African descent. And they chose a certain color scheme that represented or imitated, in a way, the colors that you see in African fabrics. So the bright oranges and reds and electric purples. And they didn't tell us, like, you must use these colors, but they did say that we weren't allowed to use white to lighten our color palette. So on our palette, we could have yellow or pink or orange. So right away, you're as you lighten a shade by using yellow, it's going to get more intense instead of a more dull or pastel that might happen if you use white. And I think that was, in a way, so that it was twofold. It was so that our artwork could look very vibrant and reflect the colors of African fabrics, but it was also, in a way, like refuting the Beaux-Arts, the European arts tradition, in that we're creating our own palette in our own way to see and mix colors. And you'll see that when I work. I mean, I use African fabrics in my work directly, and the colors that I choose are still very much aligned with the Afro-Cobra teachings, although that is not what I'm doing deliberately. But because that was the way I was trained, that is what I'm still doing.
So you often talk about the misconception that enslaved Africans couldn't retain any of their traditions from Africa because many of the oldest African quilts are actually reflective of African sensibilities. Tell us about this misconception.
Well, I think it's the idea when you talk about quilting with Black people, usually people start with, they say, well, they've heard that slaves used quilts to communicate codes to each other, like secret codes. And if you laid a certain quilt out on a fence and it had, let's say, like the bear paw, that might mean that you were going to, they were signals saying that it soon would be time to escape, and that the bear paw might indicate that a certain person, maybe even Harriet Tubman herself or another type person who was a conduit for the Underground Railroad, might be coming near. Um, those things, I'm not really sure if they're true or not. You know, there's a lot of debate because some people are saying that there's not evidence of that. And so maybe it isn't, I'm not sure. But what there is evidence of, when you look at the quilts that Black people made for themselves, not the quilts that they may have been commissioned or pressed to make for their masters and mistresses and other people that did use European quilt patterns, but the quilts that they made on their own, and you'll see those, like when you look at the G's Ben quilters, you'll see this improvisational quilt design. You see different colors being used. You'll see different figurative elements being used that were not European. And they actually didn't just, it didn't come out of the blue, is what I mean, with the Women of G's Ben and the other quilts like that you might see. There's a famous quilt by a woman named Harriet Powers, who I think that she was a slave at some point, but she was freed. And she actually made a living sewing for other people. And she sewed quilts and she sold them at, I think, like open air markets. And this is during the slave era. And two of her pieces have been preserved. One is at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. I'm not sure where the other one is. But in her quilt, she's depicted like falling stars and people and cows. And when you look at that quilt, and then you look at another type of, it's an applique made in Benin, but at the time, Benin was called Dahomey. But when you look at these, uh, they're applique like flags that are made in Benin, and you'll see the same animal shapes that Harriet Powers used in hers. The quilts of G's Ben, that so-called improvisational quilting, when you look at kente cloth and African textiles, kuba cloth and mud cloth, you'll see the same arrangement of abstract figures you see the same colors being chosen, although they're using different materials because they're across the ocean and hundreds of years later. When you compare those two things, you realize that these women and these people were able to retain something of their lives in Benin and all the way back to Dahomey. I mean, if you were to ask these women in Alabama or South Carolina, are they African? Most likely they would say no. I mean, they're African American, born and bred, and their ancestors, as far back as they can remember, were born here. Where did those designs come from? Who were the original women who taught them? That's all been taught down mothers to daughters to sons over the generations.
You know, your stories and your explanations put a heartbeat behind these quilts and this art, and I think add a definite appreciation to what people are experiencing. You've talked about the fact that combining sewing with fine art is becoming much more accepted. Tell us about that.
Well, when I first started making quilts in grad school, it was about 2002. And that's when the quilts of G's Ben just were launching, I guess, that big exhibit. I saw it at the Whitney, I think, in New York. Um, I think it may have started in Chicago at the Art Institute. I'm a little hazy on where the exhibit started, but I saw it in New York. And I was just a college kid standing in this huge gallery looking at these quilts. And it gave me the idea that I could be a professional quilter and I could have my work on the walls in museums. I didn't know at the time that a lot of those women were still living and still are to this day in poverty like conditions. I didn't know that they were only getting like $30 per quilt or something like that. I didn't understand because I didn't know the art world. All I saw was this work on the walls, and it made it, for me, it made me shift my ideas and made me scale up and think, well, this is possible. But I ran into a lot of issues at that time because people, when I would show them my work, they would say, well, this is craft and this doesn't belong in a gallery. But you could possibly show your work at like an open fair or an art fair or a county fair or something like that. And I would show people my work. I remember going to one gallery in New York, and the owner told me that he wasn't sure if what I was doing was art at all. Um, so there was this bias against people who use cloth in their artwork. And I think that that had to do with, um, people get this idea, well, it has never been done, so somehow I guess it shouldn't be done.
There's that rule thing again, right?
Yeah, the
That's uh-huh.
rules, the rules, and the idea. I think it's just also discriminatory against art that's made by women, um, art that is made by people of color. When you think about craft, um, that all of a sudden this work gets put in a somehow lower category. And through the years, I just kept at it. I mean, this is what I could do. I couldn't go back to painting. It wasn't for me.
Mhm.
I found what I believed in fabric and making quilts. And so I just kept at it. It was slow and steady for many years. And then I got connected with the Claire Oliver Gallery in New York, and she started showing my work about 3 years ago. And right off the bat, I really felt that the crowds accepted what I was doing and that the museums were appreciative of what I was doing. And I found that my work is being acquired by museums in the contemporary arts departments, not just decorative arts or fiber arts. Um, so it seems to me that that world for people who work with fabric and fibers in general, now that line is sort of being erased. When you go around Art Basel, well, when we used to be able to go around, I would go every year in Miami and just walk through, and I could when I went for the first time in 2017, I think maybe there were like 3 or 4 artists in the whole space, and it's probably out of like 500 or 600 artists were using fabric to make art, and it's specifically fabric to make anything that was like sewn or quilter or something like that. Now, when I go through, I don't think I could count, or I could, but I wouldn't be able to do it on my 2 hands. So it's really changed.
You alluded to the fact that we used to be able to go around. So I'm going to timestamp our conversation and say we are in February of 2021 and in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And you, Bisa, are exhibiting at the Art Institute of Chicago. Um, what's this experience like in the midst of a shutdown?
Oh, strange. Very strange. Let's say that. It's a lot of ups and downs. My show opened officially November 14th, and I think Chicago went on an unofficial lockdown like 3 days after the show opened.
That is a fact. Exactly the timing. Great timing.
Right. It was so that was like painful. I was so grateful that I got the 3 days. I mean, the
Mhm.
show just looks remarkable. Everything is painted, and even the electrical sockets are painted this violet shade. And my grandmother's name was Violet, so the exhibition designer Richard Ferrier, he really like listened to what I said and looked at my artwork and made this space customized. And I want to say that the galleries where my artwork is being displayed are the European painting galleries, which have never shown a living artist in their space at all. And I think in the 140 years since the museum has been open, they do have contemporary artists, but they're usually going to be shown in the modern wing. Um, they're usually going to make sure that the artwork of European paintings would be that people or who lived within the 1500s or 1600s. I think the artist who showed in that space before me was El Greco, and they took down his artwork to put mine up, and I was just like, it was really mind blowing. And also, I'm the first Black artist. That goes without saying, that I'm the first Black artist to show in that space, because they were European paintings. That was what that area was sectioned off for. And then the shutdown happened, and now I think the reopening date now is February 11th. So now I'm on an upswing again. It's just a lot of like, during this pandemic and these lockdowns, it's been a lot of like disappointments and just lulls, quite frankly, lulls and being isolated at home. I'm quarantined. Well, we're not officially quarantined, but it feels like it. But I'm here with my husband and my 2 daughters. And now they're getting ready to reopen. So I'm really looking forward to that. And I really hope that they can stay open. I know that the vaccines are slowly and are very awkwardly being rolled out and very unfairly being rolled out. So we will see.
And the exhibit is at the Art Institute, I believe, until September of this year.
Yes, thank goodness. So it'll be open through the summer. And that's also a really good thing because I know that COVID kind of doesn't seem to like warm weather, and Chicago gets pretty hot in the summertime. So I think that a lot of people will be able to be out. They will be able to safely visit the exhibit. And then if they do have to stand outside, it's not like Chicago in the middle of winter. Very different. So
Indeed, it is. Indeed. Um, so, we talk about your exhibit and all that you have accomplished and the history and just how you got to where you are now. What's next for you?
what's next is more exhibits. I have a big exhibit planned for Washington, D.C. I can't say where yet, but I'm super excited about it, and that'll be coming in a couple of years. And in the meantime, I'm just going to be making artwork, preparing for that show, And also, I'll be showing at the Claire Oliver Gallery in Harlem. And I think I tend to show there twice a year. And then I still, hopefully, when these fairs pick back up, I'm excited about going back to Expo Chicago again and going back to Miami Art Week again. So that's what's in store for me.
May that all come about and happen quickly. we
Yes.
we all need to get out, and I do again want to invite our listeners to experience your art, be it a visit to the Art Institute, one of the many places that Bisa talked about, or simply watching some of her videos online. After this conversation, you can certainly experience it in a much deeper way. Bisa, I always ask our guests one question at the end, and that's, is there anything I didn't ask you that you'd like to talk about?
I guess there's one thing that I would like to mention, that I do have my Frederick Douglass artwork. The portrait is hanging at the Toledo Museum of Art right now, and they actually were able to stay open through all of this by having people visit the museum with timed entries. So if you happen to be in Toledo, please check him out. And then also I have a piece at the 21C Museum Hotels in Cincinnati. So Ohio is really winning right now for me.
They are. And is there a time limit on how long that portrait will be in Toledo?
You know what? I wish I had the answer for that. And I realized when I said that I wasn't certain when the show closes, but I know that it's still open presently.
We like hearing that things are open. Bisa, this has been an amazing conversation. We could talk forever. There is so much to what you do, and I want to thank you for sharing your story with us today. If any of our listeners would like to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to do so?
Two ways. They can find me at bisabutler.com. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook as Bisa Butler. And you can also find me on the Claire Oliver Gallery's website, which is just claireoliver.com.
Excellent. And thank you so much again for joining us on So and So today.
Thank you so much for having me, Meg. I had a ball.
And that brings us to the close of this special 100th episode celebration. On behalf of the entire So and So team, we want to express our deepest gratitude to each guest who shared their story about how they got started, what inspires them, what excites them, and their connection to this community. Every So and So episode can be found at sewandsew.com, and you'll find all of the people we mentioned and so many more incredible guests who shared their time and stories with us. And to each of you, thank you for your continued support, feedback, and enthusiasm. Every download, every comment, and every share motivates us to keep bringing you stories that spark creativity and connection. We'd love to hear from you. My email is on our website, www.soandsopodcast.com. And a very special thank you to BERNINA for their unwavering support in making this podcast possible. Here's to the next 100 episodes and beyond as we continue to celebrate the joy of making, explore new stories, some very personal, and inspire each other on the creative journey. Stay tuned for what's to come on So and So, and thank you for being a part of our story. If you know someone you think has an outstanding story, a story that should be shared on this podcast, please drop me a note to meg@sewandsew.podcast.com or complete the form on our website. Be sure to subscribe to, rate, and review this podcast on your favorite platform, and visit our website, sewandsew.podcast.com, for more information about all of our guests. That's SEWANDSO podcast.com. I'm Meg Goodman, and I look forward to you joining us next time on So and So.